Welcome, dear friends, to an extraordinary tale of love, loss, and unexpected reunions. Enjoy the story. The opulent bedroom of the Hawthorne mansion was shrouded in a somber silence, broken only by the labored breathing of Elizabeth Hawthorne. Once a vivacious socialite, Elizabeth now lay frail and pale against the silk pillows of her four-poster bed. Her son Michael sat beside her, his hand gently clasping hers, while Admiral William Hawthorne stood at the foot of the bed, his usually commanding presence subdued by worry. "Michael, darling," Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper. "I fear I don't have much time left. Oh, how I wish I could meet your fiancé before I go." Michael's grip on his mother's hand tightened, guilt gnawing at his insides. "Mom, please don't talk like that. You're going to be fine, you'll see." Admiral Hawthorne cleared his throat, his voice gruff with emotion. "Now, Elizabeth, you listen to our boy. You've got plenty of fight left in you." Elizabeth managed a weak smile. "Oh, William, always the optimist. But I know my time is coming. Michael, tell me about her again. Your girl in Germany. What was her name?" Michael swallowed hard, his mind racing. Emma. Her name is Emma, Mom. She's wonderful. You'd love her." "I'm sure I would." Elizabeth sighed, her eyes drifting closed. "I just wish I could meet her." As Elizabeth dozed off, Michael exchanged a pained look with his father. The lie weighed heavily on him, but how could he tell his dying mother that at 35 he was still single, married to his career at the U.S. Embassy in West Germany? Later that evening, Michael paced the plush carpets of the family living room, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Admiral Hawthorne watched his son from his leather armchair, a tumbler of scotch in his hand. "Son, you've got to do something about this fiancé situation," the Admiral said, his tone brooking no argument. "Your mother, well, the doctors say she doesn't have long, a month, maybe 2. It would mean the world to her to meet Emma." Michael stopped pacing, turning to face his father. "Dad, I can't. There's no Emma. I made her up." The Admiral's eyebrows shot up. "You what?" "I invented a fiancé," Michael confessed, sinking onto the couch. "When Mom got sick and you told me how bad it was, I just wanted her to have some peace of mind, to think I wasn't going to be alone." William Hawthorne set down his glass, leaning forward. "Michael, I understand you meant well, but this deception, it can't continue. Your mother deserves the truth." "And break her heart in her final days?" Michael shook his head vehemently. "I can't do that, Dad. I won't." The Admiral sighed heavily. "Then what do you propose we do?" Michael stood up, a determined glint in his eye. "I'll figure something out. Just give me a little time." As Michael left the room, Admiral Hawthorne picked up his scotch again, downing it in one gulp. He had a sinking feeling that his son's well-intentioned lie was about to spiral out of control. The next morning, unable to bear the suffocating atmosphere of the house and the weight of his deception, Michael decided to take his father's boat out for a spin. The sleek vessel cut through the sparkling waters of the Atlantic, and for a moment, Michael felt a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in years. As he navigated along the coast, he marveled at how much had changed since he'd left for his diplomatic post in Germany. New resorts dotted the shoreline, their gleaming facades a testament to the booming economy. Yet, amidst the development, pockets of untouched beauty remained, secluded coves and stretches of pristine beach that looked just as they had in his childhood. Michael cut the engine, letting the boat drift gently on the waves. He closed his eyes, feeling the warm sun on his face and the salty breeze ruffling his hair. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life where he wasn't burdened by expectations, his father's, his mother's, his own, a life where he could just be. His reverie was abruptly shattered by a scream. Michael's eyes snapped open, scanning the water. There, not 50 yards from his boat, a woman was thrashing in the waves, one arm wrapped tightly around a small child. Without hesitation, Michael gunned the engine, maneuvering the boat closer to the struggling pair. As he drew near, he could see the terror in the woman's eyes, hear the child's frightened wails. "Hold on!" he shouted, cutting the engine and diving into the water. The woman was barely keeping herself and the child afloat. Michael reached them, just as she began to sink beneath the surface. With one strong arm, he grasped the woman around the waist, using the other to help support the child. "I've got you," he reassured them, kicking powerfully towards the boat. "You're safe now." It took all of Michael's strength to heave them onto the deck of the boat. As they lay there, coughing and gasping, Michael quickly checked them for injuries. The woman looked up at him, her green eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you," she managed between breaths. "You saved our lives." It was only then, as the adrenaline began to subside, that Michael truly looked at the woman he'd rescued. She was beautiful, with sun-kissed skin and hair the color of honey. The child, a little girl no more than a year old, clung to her tightly. "Are you okay?" Michael asked, handing them towels. "What happened?" The woman wrapped the towel around herself and the child. "We were walking on the pier. Sophie here got excited by a seagull and she just toppled over. I jumped in after her, but the current was so strong." She trailed off, hugging the little girl closer. Michael noticed a slight accent in her speech. "I'm Michael," he said, offering his hand. "Michael Hawthorne." "Nancy," she replied, shaking his hand. "Nancy Weber. And this little troublemaker is Sophie." As Michael steered the boat back towards the shore, he found himself captivated by Nancy. There was something about her, a strength, a sadness perhaps, that intrigued him. And then, as they neared the beach, an idea began to form in his mind. A crazy, potentially disastrous idea. "Nancy," he began hesitantly, "I know this is going to sound strange, but I have a favor to ask you." As they sat on the sun-warmed sand, Sophie napping peacefully beside them, Michael poured out his story to Nancy. He told her about his mother's illness, about the fictional fiancé he'd invented, about his desperate need to bring some comfort to Elizabeth in her final days. Nancy listened intently, her expression a mix of sympathy and disbelief. When Michael finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "So," she said finally, "you want me to pretend to be your fiancé? To lie to your dying mother?" Put that way, it sounded terrible. Michael winced. "I know it's a lot to ask, and I know how it sounds, but I just can't bear the thought of disappointing her now." Nancy looked out at the ocean, absently running her fingers through Sophie's damp curls. "It's crazy," she murmured. Then, to Michael's surprise, she laughed. "But then again, my life has been nothing but crazy for as long as I can remember." She turned back to Michael, a wry smile on her face. "All right, Mr. Hawthorne, I'll be your pretend fiancé, but only because I owe you for saving our lives." Relief washed over Michael. "Thank you, Nancy. You have no idea what this means to me." As they shook hands on their bizarre agreement, neither could have imagined the extraordinary turn their lives were about to take. As Nancy agreed to Michael's outlandish plan, her mind drifted back to her own past, to the shores of another sea, in another time. Nancy Weber, née Natasha Volkov, stood on the shores of the Black Sea, her toes sinking into the warm sand. It was 1965, and at 30 years old, she was finally back in the place of her birth. Her 9-month-old daughter, Sophie, gurgled happily in her arms, oblivious to the weight of history that surrounded them. "Oh, Sophie," Nancy whispered, her voice catching. "If only you knew the stories these waves could tell." As she walked along the beach, memories washed over her like the gentle tide. She remembered running along this very shore as a little girl, her parents laughing as they chased her. She remembered the smell of her mother's borscht, the sound of her father's deep, rumbling laugh. But those happy memories were overshadowed by darker ones, memories of war, of fear, of loss. Nancy closed her eyes, and suddenly she was 7 years old again, huddled in her childhood home as the world fell apart around her. Natasha Volkov huddled under her blanket, trying to block out the sounds of distant explosions. It was 1942, and the Nazi occupation of their small Soviet town had turned their world upside down. "Natasha, darling," her mother, Anna, whispered urgently. "We have to go, now." Bleary-eyed, Natasha stumbled out of bed. "Where are we going, Mama? Where's Papa?" Anna's face tightened with worry. "Papa is Papa is fighting the bad men, sweetheart. We're going to your grandmother's in Kerch. It'll be safer there. As they hurriedly packed a small bag, Natasha noticed the bruises on her mother's arms, poorly hidden by her sleeves. She knew her mother had been working for the German officers, cleaning their offices. The neighbors called her a traitor, but Natasha had heard her mother crying at night, had seen how little food there was before her mother took the job. They slipped out of the house before dawn, joining the stream of refugees fleeing the advancing German army. Natasha clutched her mother's hand tightly, her little legs struggling to keep up. They had barely made it a few miles when a German truck rattled to a stop beside them. A young officer leaned out, smiling. "Where are you ladies headed?" he asked in halting Russian. "Kerch?" Anna replied warily. The officer's smile widened. "What luck! We're heading that way. Hop in." Natasha felt her mother's hand tighten around hers. There was fear in Anna's eyes, but also resignation. They had no choice. "Natasha, get in the cab with the nice officer," Anna said, her voice trembling slightly. "But Mama—" "It's okay, sweetheart. I'll be right behind you in the back." As the truck pulled away, Natasha turned to wave at her mother. It was the last time she would see her for over 2 decades. The next few years passed in a blur for young Natasha. She was taken to Austria, where she ended up on the farm of Karl and Greta Weber. They were kind people, opposed to the Nazi regime, but powerless to stop it. They took Natasha in, treating her as their own daughter, alongside their son, Peter. At first, Natasha was lost in a sea of strange words and unfamiliar customs. But children are resilient, and soon she was chattering away in German, helping with the farm chores, and playing with Peter as if she'd always been there. Still, at night, she would take out the small photo she had managed to keep hidden, a picture of her family, taken in happier times. She would trace the faces of her parents and brother, whispering their names like a prayer. As the war drew to a close and the Allies liberated Austria, Karl and Greta faced a difficult decision. They had grown to love Natasha as their own, but they knew she had a family somewhere in the Soviet Union. "What if they're all gone?" Greta fretted. "What if we send her back and she ends up in some horrible orphanage?" Karl nodded grimly. "And even if her family is alive, who knows what the Soviets will do to her after she's lived here for so long?" In the end, they decided to keep Natasha with them. They told her that they would try to find her real family when things settled down. But as the years passed and the Iron Curtain descended, that promise became increasingly difficult to keep. And so Natasha became Nancy Weber, an Austrian farmer's daughter with a hidden past and a heart full of conflicting loyalties. Back in the present, Nancy stood in the opulent foyer of the Hawthorne mansion, her heart pounding. She smoothed down her borrowed dress, feeling like an imposter in more ways than one. Michael squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You'll be great," he whispered. "Just remember, your name is Emma, you're from Munich, and we met at a diplomatic function." Nancy nodded, taking a deep breath. But as Michael led her into the living room, she froze. There, hanging above the fireplace, was a large framed photograph. A photograph she knew intimately, for a copy of it had been her most treasured possession for over 2 decades. It was her family, her real family. "Michael," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "That picture." Michael followed her gaze, confused. "Oh, that's an old family photo. That's me as a baby with my parents and my sister. We lost her during the war." Nancy's mind reeled. It couldn't be. It was impossible. And yet— With shaking hands, she reached into her purse and pulled out the worn, creased photo she always carried with her. She held it up next to the framed picture. Michael's eyes widened in shock. "What? How do you have this?" Tears streamed down Nancy's face as the truth crashed over her like a wave. "Michael," she whispered, "I'm not your fiancé. I'm your sister." The next few hours were a whirlwind of tears, explanations, and long-buried emotions bubbling to the surface. Admiral Hawthorne was summoned, his usually stoic demeanor crumbling as he embraced the daughter he thought he'd lost forever. And Elizabeth. When Michael and Nancy entered her room, Elizabeth's eyes lit up with a joy that seemed to push back the shadow of illness. "My baby," she breathed, reaching out with trembling hands. "My Natasha. I always knew you'd come back to us." As the family reunited, sharing stories and filling in the gaps of lost years, it was as if a missing piece had finally clicked into place. Sophie toddled around the room, doted on by her newfound grandparents, while Michael watched in amazement as his pretend fiancée transformed into his long-lost sister. Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth's health improved dramatically. The doctors were baffled, but the Hawthorns knew the truth. Love and joy were the best medicines of all. 6 months later, the extended Hawthorne family gathered in Nancy's home in Austria to celebrate New Year's Eve. Elizabeth, looking healthier than she had in years, sat by the fire with Sophie on her lap, while Admiral Hawthorne regaled Peter Weber with tales from his naval days. Nancy watched it all with a sense of wonder. Her two worlds, so long separate, had finally merged into one. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Michael, grinning broadly. "So," he said, nudging her playfully, "I hear you've been playing matchmaker." Nancy laughed. "Well, someone had to help you in the romance department, brother dear, and Sophia is perfect for you." Michael's gaze drifted to where Sophia, Nancy's Swiss friend, was chatting animatedly with Carl and Greta Weber. A soft smile played on his lips. "You know," he said, "when I asked you to pretend to be my fiancé, I never imagined it would lead to all this. Finding you, reuniting our family, and now, well, maybe finding love for real." Nancy smiled, linking her arm through her brother's. "Life has a funny way of working out, doesn't it? Who would have thought that a little white lie could lead to so much truth?" As the clock struck midnight and cheers erupted around them, Nancy felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She was home, truly home, surrounded by both the family of her birth and the family that had raised her.